Hello, everyone. We have a very full day today, so we're going to go ahead and get started right on time. My name is Audrey Vernick, and I'm the Director of Patient and Family Advocacy for the Pediatric Epilepsy Surgery Alliance. I've probably emailed you or talked to you, or you've watched me on a webinar, or we've seen each other on Facebook, so hi. Nice to see you in person. I'm really honored today to introduce two really incredible social workers that I've had the privilege of working with. Megan Keeler is with Lurie Children's Hospital of Chicago, and Chris Ryan is here at Boston Children's Hospital, and they're going to talk about how to get help taking advantage of social supports. Take it away.
Thanks, Audrey. Good morning, everybody. I'm Chris Ryan. I'm a social worker at Boston Children's. It's really great to be part of this great event. We do a lot of work with the Alliance. They're really great partners. So it's great to see such a large turnout. Thanks. So as mentioned, I'm a social worker at Boston Children's. Megan is a social worker at Lurie in Chicago. And we have no disclosures to report. So our objectives for this talk, our hope is to foster a better understanding of the psychosocial comorbidities of epilepsy. We also hope that to introduce the role of the medical social worker as a key support. A couple notes, by sort of way of definition, psychosocial comorbidities may not be a term that you're familiar with, but what a psychosocial comorbidity is the presence of other health or mental health conditions or other social issues that come along with a primary diagnosis. And for the purposes of this, it would be epilepsy. So I really like this slide because I think it illustrates the point that we know that epilepsy is much more than seizures, right? Many families have said to me, they didn't appreciate or understand really all the factors that went in initially with the diagnosis of epilepsy. And there are many, many things that under the surface that we often encounter that can be major barriers, including things like school issues, mood problems and behaviors, other diagnoses, family and lifestyle impacts, financial impact, feelings of isolation and stigma, loss of independence. These are all the psychosocial comorbidities that I'm talking about. For our presentation, we're going to focus on three main areas. We're going to talk about learning in school. We're going to focus on mood and behavior, and then we're going to focus on lifestyle impact. At the conclusion of this, we've built in some time for questions, hopefully quite a bit of time. We're happy to field questions on any number of topics. So let's start with school and learning. So many of the common learning issues that come along with epilepsy include issues related to attention, language and memory. We see commonly other diagnoses, neurodevelopmental diagnoses like intellectual disability, autism spectrum disorder, which both come with very complex learning issues and needs. We know that living with a chronic illness, particularly an unpredictable one like a seizure disorder, often leads to significant missed school time, right? Both planned routine care, unexpected missed time, and then if our kids are working up through a surgical through a surgery, it may include very extended missed time in school. We know that medications may have a pretty significant impact on cognition that we have to factor in. And then also the larger impact on quality of life, stress, and mental health issues all have the potential to impact learning. So because of this, it's really important to think about accommodations for our children when they're in school. And in order to identify what needs are, what the learning needs of our children are, and what accommodations might be appropriate, it's critical that children are screened for academic services. And I want to talk about a couple different types of evaluations and just sort of describe the difference between a neuropsychological evaluation, which I suspect many of you in this room are familiar with, compared to a school-based evaluation. So, a neuropsychological evaluation is a very broad eval, often part of regular epilepsy care. Particularly if a child is going through a surgical workup, it's typically part of that. And these evaluations encompass much more than just the academic piece, but may have an academic component of the evaluation and may come with very specific academic recommendations for services. Now, a school-based evaluation, comparing that, school-based evaluation typically is much more focused, narrowly focused on the academics. Now, if you're getting your child evaluated for school services and you've already had a neuropsychological evaluation, it's very important that you also go through the school-based evaluation, even though it may be redundant and not as broad as the neuropsychological evaluation. And the reason why that's important is that schools are not obligated to accept the results from an outside evaluation for the purposes of developing service plans. I would encourage you to share any academic recommendations that you may have from a neuropsychological evaluation with that team. And certainly if at the planning stage when a school is proposing specific services, if you've already gone through an evaluation through your epilepsy center, it's a great way to compare to see if there's any obvious gaps in services on what the school is proposing, okay? Now, the two main accommodation plans that we see as a result of screening would be an IEP and a 504 plan. And an IEP is a provisions of special education services that are very specialized and individualized based on a child's disability. There's two main qualifiers. A child has to have a number of, one of 13 disability categories. Our children with epilepsy often qualify under the other health impairment qualifier, which includes neurological disorders. They may qualify under multiple disabilities depending on their health status, but that's a common one. And then in addition to qualifying with the disability, that disability also must affect a child's educational performance or their ability to access learning, right? An IEP may include health and safety accommodations. It may also include, it does include where the services are delivered. So if your child has very complex health needs or complex behavioral health needs, they may not be able to be served in your local school or your local school district even. So the second one would be a 504 plan, and a 504 plan again is also based on qualifying with disabilities, a much broader range of disabilities. And a 504 plan can have a mix of health and safety accommodations. So, for instance, like a seizure action plan or maybe seizure monitoring, on the bus, or one-to-one aid if your child is at risk for falls. But a 504 plan can also include a whole range of academic supports that are just not within an IEP. I want to talk briefly about some special circumstances when we think of extra accommodations that may sit on top of like an existing service plan or like just a new plan if a child doesn't have an academic service plan. And we think about those in circumstances when our children are out of school for long periods of time. And I think, going through a surgery is a good example of this. This afternoon, Monica, I think later today, is actually giving a specific talk on IEP planning post-surgery. So I would encourage you to go to that. She's going to take a much deeper dive on this. I'm going to actually sit on that. I'm sure it's great. But when we think about our kids returning to school, these are very individualized, again, to our children's needs. And I, in my program, I really lean on our neuropsychology team who are part of that pre-surgical evaluation to make specific recommendations on what it looks like for reintegration into school. But very general recommendations that we give are, we try to really set very, very reasonable, low expectations for academic requirements when our kids are going back to school, even when on the surface they seem like they're back to themselves. And we make recommendations around retention of existing knowledge versus incorporating lots of new concepts. We also discourage kids to be required to make up work that was missed during their time off. We also don't encourage bringing in like tutoring during the recovery phase. We really want our kids to have plenty of time to spend on necessary therapies they might need, including like cognitive therapies and things like that, rather than really sort of trying to catching up with the academic piece. So let's talk a little bit about mental health and behavior. So, we see a range of types of behavioral health problems associated with epilepsy, including anxiety, depression, inattention, and hyperactivity. In neurodevelopmental disorders like autism and intellectual disability, which may come with their own complex behavioral health needs. We see high rates of depression, ADHD, all of which may require supports. What contributes to mood problems, attention, and behavioral health problems? It's often a pretty complicated mix of factors. And we often don't know what the true source of symptoms are. It might be underlying mental health diagnoses. We know that people with epilepsy have higher rates of depression and anxiety. Depending where seizure activity is coming from in the brain or the brain structure may contribute to mood. We know that medications can contribute to mood issues, right? Some medications can exacerbate or worsen mood and behaviors. Some of our medications can really stabilize mood, right? We also know that like the expected stress of living with a chronic illness, lifestyle restrictions, all the rest of it, it's a normal reaction for that to impact mood and behavior. And so when we're faced with a situation where we see a range of symptoms that we don't always know what the source is, we do know that we want to address those symptoms. We want to get supports for them. And because of this, it's really important to do screening. So we try to regularly screen for mental health symptoms, to identify symptoms at their early stages, and to provide referrals and support for those. Because we know that untreated mental health symptoms can become acute over time, right? Untreated depression and anxiety can worsen and can include, suicidal behaviors. So screening is critical. And many traditional approaches work. Megan's going to talk more detail about them in her half of this presentation. Psychiatric medications can be safe and effectively used. And another consideration when we're thinking about behavioral mental health symptoms is that we always want to look back to the school accommodations, because when we have our children that are in school settings or without appropriate accommodations, it's a huge, significant source of frustration and stress and can really contribute to underlying mood problems. So it's one of the things that we're always looking at, sort of the school piece of it, to make sure that there's not some unmet need at the school. So finally, just want to talk briefly about quality of life. So we know living with a chronic illness, particularly one that is unpredictable, can feel really isolating, both for patients and families. We hear all the time about the lifestyle restrictions, both from our kids and their families, right? The number one complaint I hear from our teens is the loss of driving, right? The impact on personal independence, missing out on favorite activities, things like that. We encourage families and patients to try to normalize life as possible. We encourage them to work with their medical providers to come up with like reasonable safety plans to maximize life as much as possible, right? We also know that the financial implications of caring for a child with a chronic illness can have significant financial implications, financial stress related to underemployment, loss of income, missed work, right? Insurance costs, healthcare expenditures. The other big one that's, I think, underappreciated is caregiver expenses, right? Our kids with complex health needs that require 24/7 supports. Refractory epilepsy requires constant monitoring, right? And so families are bringing in extra caregivers all the time. many times not covered by insurance, and so that's a huge expense. So I want to pivot, hand this over to Megan. She's going to talk about leveraging your social work team to line up supports. Thanks.
Hard act to follow. I told Chris that he was my mentor, which is true. We are both medical social workers, but I'm sort of new to the pediatric surgery world, and I'm really happy to be with you today. I had a lot of nerves this morning, but seeing all of you with your kids, it's very heartening, and I'm happy to be here. So pivoting a little to talk about the role of a medical social worker. Social work plays an integral role in supporting families who are considering surgery. Broadly, the role of a medical social worker is to help families understand their child's condition, to act as a conduit for communication between the medical team and families, and provide families with resources to help support them throughout their illness. This kind of support can be brief, in terms of a brief intervention, or more long-term support, depending upon the chronicity of the condition. And some of our duties as medical social workers include addressing issues that may exist with new admissions and coordinating care of patients with complex needs. Most social workers who work in hospital settings have master's degrees, are state licensed, and have completed hundreds of hours of training. Medical social workers connect people with coping support, mental health interventions and referrals. We provide patient and family education, school advocacy, basic needs support related to the resources for housing instability and food insecurity that families may face, and financial and insurance support, and also assistance with public programs like SSI and Medicaid. Medical social workers interact with patients and families, our multidisciplinary teams, community resources, daycares and schools, and public and private agencies. As you know, families who have experiences with epilepsy do not exist in the bubble of an inpatient admission or a clinic visit. And social workers function as really hubs of support, connecting our families with resources both within the hospital and out in the community. We support families in many different contexts. And we also use assessments to guide our support for families and patients. So while some assessments can seem like more of a conversation and are informal, we also utilize formal assessments. And these assessments are standardized to inform the multidisciplinary teams that we work on how to individualize supports over time. We collect information about a patient or caregiver's baseline, and then we reassess when needed. Some formal assessments listed here address quality of life issues, depression and anxiety, and acute symptom screens such as those for PTSD. We also assess a family's financial stability and insurance status with the aim of mitigating those financial impacts that Chris discussed of chronic illness or unexpected health-related expenses. Some social workers also utilize surveys that are administered by their respective institutions. At Lurie Children's in Chicago, we request that families respond to surveys that focus on the patient and family experience. And that information has helped to guide my team in the development of social work support for our surgical families. So we appreciate your input always. So talking about behavior interventions, as Chris mentioned, many patients with epilepsy also experience challenges with their mental health and behavior. We work on multidisciplinary teams that assess for and provide referrals for interventions for those challenges. We encourage families to utilize intervention to build coping skills and more positive behaviors. And here's a few of those interventions that both Chris and I have provided to our families. Some behavior interventions include parent management training, which sounds a little daunting as a caregiver, but really the aim is to give parents the tools to address a patient's challenging behaviors. Applied behavioral analysis therapy, or ABA, is a type of intensive therapy that helps a patient develop social and emotional skills. We also complete referrals for our patients to engage with cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a type of therapy that addresses change in one's thinking and can be helpful for patients who experience anxiety or avoidant behaviors. And then we also refer to psychiatrists who can diagnose and manage medications for patients with ADHD, anxiety, and other co-occurring diagnoses. So as medical social workers, we also connect families with resources that assist with and build coping skills. Some that I know both Chris and I, in planning for this, we were brainstorming about all of the resources that we connect our families to, and this is kind of a short list of what we came up with. Obviously, we use the Pediatric Epilepsy Surgical Alliance Parent Navigators. They have proven to be really invaluable for our families who are considering surgeries. We also connect families with both national and local epilepsy foundations. As discussed previously, mental health resources and therapists. We connect families with support groups aimed at caregivers, aimed at siblings of patients, and at the patients themselves. And these can be both in-line and in-person support groups. I have on here as well faith-based groups, and while they might not be specific in terms of maybe coping specifically with epilepsy, I think that they can be a great resource for families to tap into for overall support. We also connect families with community education programs that provide classes about seizure first aid and overall epilepsy diagnosis. Peer match programs. We have a program called PeerWise at Lurie Children's where we have kind of older patients in the program who serve as mentors and guides for younger patients who might have questions about managing their own health. And then we also refer and recommend self-management groups like the Managing Epilepsy Well network. So another source of support are more formal government social service programs, and some of these are means tested or based on income. So it's important to note that not every family would qualify for some of these resources. But we have a list here that includes early intervention for patients with developmental delays from birth to 3 years old. We assist with supplemental security income determinations and appeals. We also connect families with WIC nutrition resources and support, Medicaid applications and redeterminations. We connect families with vocational rehabilitation programs to help adults with disabilities connect with opportunities. Another great resource are community and home-based services and respite care programs, which are invaluable to caregivers. Medical social workers also support patients and families with the transition to adult health care. Now that can include formulating a medical power of attorney for the patient or formal guardianship process. Finally, as part of the transition to adult services, Social workers can educate and connect patients with services for disabled adults, such as day and other employment programs. All really great services to support families and individuals with epilepsy. So speaking more specifically about our roles and how we support families with who are considering surgery, some of these opportunities to support are highlighted on this timeline. So we certainly are there and offer support during an initial epilepsy diagnosis. We help to provide coping support with that diagnosis, provide education about the diagnosis, and provide anticipatory guidance about what that might look like for families. And we, at the time of diagnosis, can connect families with the relevant community and government resources. We're really educators at this point. And then if we've got refractory epilepsy in the picture and surgery is on the table, we provide sort of psychosocial supports, which are holistic assessments of how best to support and assist a family when they're contemplating surgery. We also assist with identifying important support networks for that family and the logistical planning that might go into considering surgery. So for us at Lurie, that might look like connecting families with referrals to Ronald McDonald House, and even assessing and having conversations about when would be a better time for the family to have that surgery given their needs or preferences. The prospect of brain surgery or neuromodulation is incredibly stressful for caregivers, for patients, for siblings. This pre-surgical phase is also a time to connect families with support groups and leverage any existing coping resources that may have been helpful for the family throughout the early treatment plan and diagnosis phase. So we kind of remind you of who to tap into. During the perioperative phase, we provide concrete resources to facilitate bedside stays for families. We provide frequent check-ins during surgery and the recovery phase. I always check in with families who are waiting in that OR waiting room to encourage you to step away. A 6-hour, 8-hour surgery is a long time to wait. So I like to be that familiar face and say, we're almost there. We're on the other side almost. We also facilitate communication with the neurosurgery and epilepsy services at that time and provide anticipatory guidance about in- and outpatient physical and occupational therapy if it's indicated post-surgery. And then finally, the post-operative phase, we provide check-ins. At Lurie, we do a 2-week post-op clinic to check wounds, make sure everything is healing well, but also the social work's role is to assess for any school support needs or changes and see how we can help if there are any mood and behavior changes post-operatively. So here are some key takeaways to consider that support families such as your own. First, as Chris mentioned, epilepsy is definitely more than just seizures. I think the image of the icebergs puts it very well. You've got the seizures above the waterline and everything else underneath the water. And we are intimately aware of these things because we've supported many, many families in their surgical journeys. It's certainly can be a very fearful and isolating experience, and we know that. Secondly, social workers assist with coping. We address mental health concerns. We assist families with resources. But above all, and I really want to drive this home, we are advocates. We're your advocates. We advocate on behalf of the families that we support. And finally, social workers are an integral part of assisting patients and families through the surgical process. We really provide support at every phase of the process. I like to call it longitudinal support. I am that face that is continuous throughout diagnosis to post-op. So on behalf of Chris Ryan and myself, we encourage you to tap into the social worker at your epilepsy medical home, no matter where you might be on the surgical timeline. We really thank you for joining us, and we'll take your questions. And if you'll please keep them as general as possible, we are being recorded.
Yeah, and also just to note, we Megan and I will both be here afterwards. If you're not feeling comfortable standing up and asking a question, we're happy to have a sidebar with you afterwards. We're both going to be here for a while. One other thing I wanted to mention, Megan and I are both social workers. We recognize that you may be in a center or in an area of the country that doesn't have a social worker, right? These supports can come in many different forms. There's some unique things that clinical social workers do that we have specific training on, particularly on the mental health side and the assessments, but there can be lots of great supports from peers, from community health workers, through primary care offices, through state foundations of the Epilepsy Foundation. So just want to just note that we're not everywhere, unfortunately.
We are not.
Yeah. Question, yeah. Yeah, so great question. So just to summarize, early in life, hemispherectomy, multiple years later, still ongoing needs, and it's hard to assess sort of like what the needs are currently based on what they were at the outset, I think. Yeah. Sure, yeah. Yeah, and so some of these push a little beyond at least my expertise here, but what I can say is, right, this journey can be, throughout life, and that can be hard, right? I recognize that, and I think that it's critical to stay connected with your specialty program, to tap into that expertise, to get referrals for ongoing assessments over time, whether it's neuropsychological or referrals to community-based behavioral assessment, evaluations, mental health assessments. I know I'm not necessarily directly answering your questions, other than to say that, like, just because we've gone, child's been through surgery, it doesn't mean it's the end of the journey, unfortunately, right? And I think it's critical to stay connected with a center that has multiple specialties that can tap into those subspecialty experts to do assessments over time, to inform ongoing care, because, right, our kids' needs changes as they grow and get older, and that's one of the reasons why we want to continually assess them over time to help support them in different ways as their needs change. They're going to, right? Particularly if seizures continue. So I know I'm not 100% answering the question, but doing my best. Yeah. I don't know if you want to add anything.
And I wouldn't discount maybe the role that school assessments can play into it as well. Really partnering with special education programs might be a piece of that puzzle as well.
Yeah, you bring up a really great point and a real gap, a real gap in support and services, because so what I think you were describing is that your child has behaviors and needs that mirror behaviors and needs that we see in a population that has a diagnosis of autism, right? But because of the laws and sort of insurance provisions, they're typically not covered, because you don't have that diagnosis, right? And so this is a big conundrum that families find themselves in often. I can say that there are providers, behavioral health providers that have the training in ABA. So there's two ways, right? I mean, some people choose to private pay for that stuff. I know that's not necessarily sustainable for most folks because it's hugely expensive, right? There are providers who do provide, who have the training, who aren't necessarily ABA specialists that can be reimbursed through insurances. The other option, and I've seen families with success with this, is that they advocate tirelessly with their providers to get detailed descriptions. So for instance, like I've been on many of these cases to help support families who are trying to do exactly what you're doing, to try and make a medical case, a case to why this child has these whole range of behaviors and support needs, that if they had the diagnosis of autism, they would be getting it, you'd be able to reimburse it through insurance. And so we have to make a sort of a case to say, like, here's what these behaviors look like, here's what they mirror. There's a medical necessity, behavioral health necessity, that this child receive these services. And I've had families with success with that. It's not easy. No. Particularly with the commercial insurance plans. I've seen more people have success when they have like a secondary Medicaid attached to that, because there's just a wider range of providers. So not an easy one, and a big gap. There's also a lot of legislative advocacy being done at a state and national level to address some of these gaps as well. Slow moving, unfortunately. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, you make a great point that I should have. Yeah, if in case people didn't hear, school can be a sort of a Band-Aid approach, and another sort of way. Some families do it with a patchwork of ways, and a school. If our kids are eligible for special education services, we should be trying to maximize as much as we can through the school, through their IEP, because we want to get those services where our children are, and to services that they're entitled to. So that's a great point.
And I can't speak to the state of Massachusetts, but there are insurance advocates in the state of Illinois. That is their job. They fight tirelessly with families to get ABA services approved through insurance. So that's something that you could potentially look into.
disability law. There's
Yeah.
there's a lot of, there's many disability law advocates around the country that families sometimes will tap into as well. That can be a great resource, just even if it's just coaching around what the language might look like that's needed in an appeal with an insurance provider. A question over here. Yeah.
Two questions ago, you did bring up the fact that there is legislative advocacy. There's a lot of different work that's happening right now, but there's not going to be a ton of progress without work unless we're a part of that community also advocating for ourselves. So what do you guys find that gap is that we as parents, caregivers, the diagnosed ones themselves, like, where do we fill that gap so that we can get these supports and services and be heard properly without only working with just an advocate? There's so much more awareness that exists, so where do we do that?
Yeah, I mean, my experience, the voices that are usually the most powerful and most effective are from the patients and their parents, right? I mean, those are the ones that tend to be the most effective. I mean, we do, our state chapter of the Epilepsy Foundation has a really strong advocacy arm, and they're, always recruiting, looking for families who want to lend their voice to some of these initiatives. And so I would encourage you to, work with a state chapter. I'm not less familiar with the Alliance's advocacy efforts, but I know that's part of what they do. So but the national chapter certainly of the Epilepsy Foundation and the individual state chapters. Also, the larger pediatric health institutions. We have a large advocacy arm at Boston Children's and government relations where we help support larger initiatives at the state level, not epilepsy specific, but that's another approach as well. So. Okay.
So, can you elaborate on where families can actually find social workers besides hospitals? Like, where are you guys? We had a social worker while we were at the hospital, but now she's in the transition school. And I'm struggling to find this advocacy to understand. I don't even know what you need at school. Like, people keep saying they derive relations to me. Okay, what is that? What does she need? I don't know what to do now. Like, where would be the right way to start to look for social work? Is it the same as the hospital? Is there other community resource I can use to find a better someone who knows about cases like my own?
I would say in theory,
Restate the question.
yes,
Sorry.
of course. So correct me if I'm wrong. You're looking for social work support, assistance, kind of outside of the community, right? To connect with better services in school. Yeah. Well, in theory, and I can't really speak on behalf of Chris, but the social worker who you were connected with at the hospital, I would take a cold call from you. So I don't know if you would still have their contact information, but you can start there. And hopefully they can refer you to maybe a community health social worker or a social worker in the school. That's who you should really be partnering with to help you kind of with securing some of those resources and sort of sifting through maybe neuropsychological testing and what that means for your child. So I would start maybe with the hospital social worker that you were connected with, but also really tap into the resources at school. Do you have anything to add?
I don't think so. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Really
Yeah,
appreciate it.
thank you.
We'll both be here if anyone has additional questions.